When Emily Peterson found those 5 German shepherds hidden in the back corner of her grandfather's barn, something in her 6-year-old heart knew this wasn't just a case of abandoned pets. The largest dog, his face marked with a jagged scar that ran from eye to muzzle, positioned himself between her and a severely wounded companion lying on blood-stained hay. His low growl wasn't threatening. It was protective. Emily's small fingers trembled as she noticed the torn metal tags hanging from 2 of the dogs' necks. Even at her age, she recognized military insignia when she saw it. One dog whimpered, revealing a pattern of healed wounds that no ordinary pet would have. As she backed away slowly, a black SUV with tinted windows crawled past their property gate. The dogs tensed in unison. Emily whispered, "I won't tell anyone. I promise." Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Peterson family farm sat 20 miles outside of Oak Ridge, Kentucky, a small dot on the map that most folks drove through without a second glance. Sprawling across 60 acres of rolling hills, the white farmhouse and red barn had stood for nearly a century, weathered by time, but still proud. Autumn had painted the surrounding maple trees in fiery oranges and deep reds, their leaves carpeting the gravel driveway that led to the main house. Emily Peterson didn't remember much about living anywhere else. After her mother's accident last year, a head-on collision on Route 40 that folks still talked about in hushed tones, this farm had become her entire world. At 6 years old, she was small for her age, with untamed blonde curls and eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. Since the funeral, she'd barely spoken above a whisper, preferring the company of her sketchbook to that of the children at Oak Ridge Elementary. Frank "Pop Pop" Peterson ran the farm with the same disciplined routine he'd maintained since returning from Vietnam in '72. At 72, his back remained ramrod straight, his hands calloused from decades of hard work. The locals described him as prickly as a thistle on the outside, sweet as honey on the inside. Each morning, he woke at 5:30, put on the same style of flannel shirt, and made breakfast for Emily before the school bus arrived: eggs, toast, and a glass of milk, never varying the menu. Robert Peterson, Emily's father, was a ghost in their lives, his 18-wheeler keeping him on the road 25 days out of each month. The paychecks arrived regularly in the mail, along with the occasional postcard. But his absences had grown longer since his wife's death. When he did come home, the silence between father and daughter stretched like the endless Kentucky highway. The farm had once raised horses, but these days Frank kept only a few chickens and a large vegetable garden. The old barn stood mostly empty, its vast interior filled with shadows and forgotten farm equipment, the perfect hiding place for 5 injured German shepherds with secrets in their eyes and scars on their bodies. Dogs that moved with military precision. Dogs that watched the road with an alertness that spoke of training far beyond ordinary pets. Dogs that had chosen the Peterson farm for reasons Emily couldn't yet understand. Emily waited until her grandfather's snores echoed through the farmhouse before slipping out of bed. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 11:42 p.m. as she pulled on her rubber boots and grabbed the leftover meatloaf she'd hidden in a napkin at dinner. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet, each sound making her freeze and hold her breath. But Pop Pop's rhythmic snoring never faltered. The autumn night air bit at her cheeks as she crossed the yard, moonlight guiding her path to the barn. The massive wooden door groaned as she pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The interior smelled of hay, dust, and now the distinctive scent of animals in hiding. "I brought you food," she whispered into the darkness. At first, nothing moved. Then she heard the soft padding of paws against packed dirt. The scarred dog emerged from the shadows, his amber eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the cracks in the barn walls. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, but she stood her ground, holding out the meatloaf in her small palm. The dog approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as he assessed both the offering and the child. After what seemed like an eternity, he gently took the meat from her hand, their eyes locked in silent communication. Then he retreated to the corner where the wounded dog lay. Over the next 3 nights, Emily established a routine. She'd smuggle whatever food she could from dinner, then visit the barn after Pop-Pop fell asleep. She named each dog based on what she observed. The scarred leader became Commander. The nervous one with half an ear became Scout. The black one who moved like a shadow became Shadow. The strongest and most protective became Ranger. And the severely injured white-gray one became Ghost. Ghost concerned her the most. His wounds weren't healing properly, and he barely touched the food she brought. Sometimes he whimpered in his sleep, his legs twitching as if running from unseen enemies. On the 4th morning, Emily was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she heard the barn door open. Her stomach dropped. Pop-Pop stood in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable as he stared into the shadowy interior. "Emily Jean Peterson," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You want to tell me why there are 5 military-grade German Shepherds in my barn?" Emily dropped the egg basket and ran to him, tears welling in her eyes. "Please don't make them leave. Pop-Pop, they're hurt, and they needed help." And Frank held up a calloused hand, silencing her. "Show me." With trepidation, Emily led her grandfather into the barn. She expected the dogs to hide, but instead, Commander stepped forward, his posture alert but not aggressive. Frank knelt down slowly, wincing as his arthritic knees protested, and extended his hand palm down. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered as Commander not only allowed the contact, but gave a subtle head movement that Emily hadn't seen before. "This ain't no ordinary stray." To Emily's astonishment, Frank wasn't angry. He inspected each dog with a methodical thoroughness that seemed oddly familiar to them. When he reached Ghost, his expression darkened. "This one needs a vet," he said grimly. "Those wounds are infected." "Are you going to call the pound?" Emily asked, her voice small. Frank stared at the tags he'd found on Commander and Ranger, turning them over in his palm. "No," he said finally, "but we need help. I know someone discreet." Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived that afternoon in a mud-splattered pickup truck, her veterinary kit in hand and skepticism in her eyes. "When you said emergency, Frank, I expected a horse with colic, not—" She trailed off as she saw the dogs. "My God! Can you help?" Frank asked. "Doctor—" Mitchell knelt beside Ghost, her trained hands gentle but efficient as she examined his wounds. "These aren't typical injuries," she said quietly. "This is—" She glanced at Emily, then back at Frank meaningfully. "Emily, go get the doctor some water from the house," Frank instructed. Once Emily was out of earshot, Dr. Mitchell continued in a hushed tone. "These are tactical working dogs, Frank, military or law enforcement. This one has extraction wounds consistent with combat situations. And these microchips, they're specialized. Frank nodded grimly. I thought so. The way they move, the way they position themselves, reminds me of the dogs in Nam. This is serious. These dogs are worth hundreds of thousands in training alone. Someone's looking for them. Someone already is, Frank replied, describing the black SUV Emily had seen. Question is, are they the right someone? After treating Ghost with antibiotics and cleaning the other dog's minor wounds, Mitchell packed up her supplies. I'm legally obligated to report lost dogs with microchips, she said carefully. Frank's expression hardened. Sarah, your daddy and I served together. These dogs found my place for a reason. Just give me a few days to figure this out. She hesitated, then nodded. 3 days. Frank, then I need to make some calls. As Dr. Mitchell's truck disappeared down the driveway, Emily emerged from behind the barn door where she'd been eavesdropping. Are they soldier dogs? Pop, pop. Frank looked down at his granddaughter, weighing how much to share. Something like that. Pumpkin. That evening, as Emily helped Frank prepare dinner, the local news played on the small kitchen television. A report caught Frank's attention. A drug bust gone wrong in Tennessee. 3 officers killed, including K9 handlers. The camera briefly showed a tactical unit emblem. Frank froze. Spatula in midair. It matched the worn patch on Commander's damaged collar. Later that night, after tucking Emily into bed, Frank made a phone call from the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. Yeah, Jim. It's Peterson. No, I'm not calling about the reunion. Listen, I've got a situation here involving some specialized working dogs. Yeah, that kind? Uh-huh. What can you tell me about the Tennessee incident last week? That bad? Huh. Who would know about... You sure about that? All right. I appreciate it. Watch yourself. He hung up, staring at the wall calendar where Emily had circled the date of her father's expected return. 3 days from now. Frank hoped that would be enough time to figure out what kind of trouble had followed these dogs to his doorstep and whether his family was now in danger because of it. Outside in the darkness, a vehicle slowed as it passed the farm entrance, headlights briefly illuminating the reflective mailbox reading Peterson. In the barn, Commander's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The next morning, Frank waited until Emily boarded the school bus before retrieving Commander's damaged collar from his workshop drawer. Sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the worn military insignia, a snarling shepherd head with the letters K9 SOG beneath it. His fingers traced the emblem. Memories flooding back of another time. Another war. When dogs like these had saved countless lives, including his own. Frank placed a call on his landline, punching the numbers from memory. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. Tactical K9 Division. Master Sergeant Wilson speaking. Wilson. It's Peterson. Frank Peterson. A pause. Well, I'll be... Sergeant Peterson. Been what? 15 years. 20. Listen, I need information on a K9 unit. Special Operations Group. The line went quiet for a moment. Peterson, you know I can't discuss. I've got 5 of their dogs in my barn. Wilson, one's barely alive, and someone's looking for them. Another pause. Longer this time. Jesus Christ, Peterson, you've got Alpha Team. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. So they are military. Not just military. Wilson's voice dropped to a near whisper. They're the most advanced tactical canine unit we've ever fielded. Specialized in narcotics detection and VIP protection. Their handlers were hit last week during an operation gone sideways in Tennessee. Officially, the dogs were reported KIA. Well, they're very much alive, and someone knows it. Peterson, listen to me carefully. Those dogs were witnesses to something big. Something that got their handlers killed. There's an internal investigation happening right now because the ambush, it shouldn't have happened. The location was classified. Frank gazed out the window toward the barn. You saying it was an inside job? I'm not saying anything official, Wilson replied cautiously. But if those dogs found you, it wasn't random. Your military background is still in the system. What do I do with them? Sit tight. I'll make some calls to people I trust. In the meantime, Peterson, watch your back. Frank had just hung up when a cloud of dust appeared at the end of his driveway. A silver pickup truck he didn't recognize rolled to a stop by his mailbox. A man in his 40s stepped out, surveying the property before approaching the house. Frank reached for the shotgun he kept by the door, then thought better of it. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, face neutral. "Help you with something," he called out. The man removed his sunglasses. "Name's Clyde Barrow. Just bought the old Miller place down the road." He gestured vaguely toward the neighboring farm that had been empty for months. "Thought I'd introduce myself to the neighbors." Frank nodded but didn't extend his hand. "Frank Peterson, welcome to the area." Clyde's eyes drifted toward the barn. "Beautiful property you've got. Do much farming these days?" "Some. Mostly keep to myself." "I hear that." Clyde smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Say, I noticed some dog tracks along the property line. You run hunting dogs?" Frank's face remained impassive. "No dogs here. Probably coyotes. They come through sometimes." "Right. Coyotes." Clyde nodded, looking unconvinced. "Well, if you ever need anything, neighbor, I'm just down the road." As the silver truck pulled away, Frank watched until it disappeared around the bend. Then he walked briskly to the barn. Inside, all 5 dogs were alert, Commander standing at attention. "Well, boys," Frank muttered, "seems we've got ourselves a situation." That afternoon, when Emily returned from school, she found Frank in the barn constructing what looked like an obstacle course with old tires, wooden planks, and metal pipes. "What are you doing?" "Pop, pop." Frank wiped sweat from his brow. "These dogs need exercise. Pumpkin, special kind of exercise." Emily watched in amazement as Frank led Commander through a series of commands, not the usual sit and stay, but complex signals using hand gestures and whistles. Commander responded with military precision, navigating the makeshift course, freezing at certain signals, and performing flanking movements that seemed choreographed. "How do you know how to do that?" Emily asked, wide-eyed. Frank hesitated. A long time ago, before your daddy was born, I worked with dogs like these in the war. In Vietnam. You never talk about that. Some things are hard to talk about. Pumpkin. Frank's eyes grew distant. But these dogs, they bring it all back. That evening, Dr. Mitchell returned to check on Ghost. As she changed his bandages, she pulled Frank aside. I ran those microchip numbers through a database I have access to, she whispered. They're classified. Frank, military working dogs. Highest level? I know, Frank replied. Made some calls of my own. Mitchell glanced nervously toward the barn door. These dogs were part of a specialized unit that protected witnesses and detected narcotics. They were involved in a major operation that went bad last week. 3 handlers dead, 2 critically injured. Frank nodded grimly. The dogs were reported killed in action, but they weren't. Dr. Mitchell's voice dropped even lower. They escaped with something, Frank. That's why Ghost has those extraction wounds. Someone tried to stop him from leaving. A chill ran down Frank's spine. What did they escape with? Dr. Mitchell shook her head. I don't know. But whatever it was, it got their handlers killed. As darkness fell, Emily sat cross-legged in the barn, sketching in her notebook while Ghost watched her with wary eyes. The other dogs patrolled the perimeter of the barn in what Frank recognized as a standard security formation. What are you drawing? Pumpkin, Frank asked, settling beside her on a hay bale. Emily turned her notebook. On the page was a startlingly detailed drawing of a man in tactical gear, his face kind but serious, kneeling beside Ghost. The detail was unsettling. She'd captured military insignia she couldn't possibly have seen before. Who is that? Frank asked carefully. Emily shrugged. I don't know. I just saw him in my head. I think he's Ghost's person. Frank studied the drawing, a chill settling in his bones. The insignia on the uniform matched those on Commander's collar exactly. Emily, have you been dreaming about these dogs? She nodded solemnly. Ghost shows me things when I sleep. He's so sad. Pop, pop. His person tried to save the other people, but the bad men knew they were coming. She flipped to another drawing, a warehouse, men with guns, dogs in tactical vests. They were tricked. Frank stared at his granddaughter, realization dawning. Somehow, Emily was connecting with the dogs in a way he couldn't explain, perhaps the pure empathy of a child, perhaps something deeper. Whatever it was, she was seeing the truth of what had happened to them. The next morning, Frank was splitting firewood when Clyde Barrow's truck appeared again. This time, Clyde brought a 6-pack of beer and an overly friendly demeanor. "Thought you might appreciate a cold one," he said, offering a bottle. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. "Bit early for me." Clyde shrugged, setting the beer on a fence post. "Beautiful day. Saw you've got the school bus stop at your property. Your kid's around." Frank's expression hardened. "Granddaughter, she's at school. Must be nice, having family close." Clyde's eyes drifted toward the barn again. "Say, I heard something strange last night. Sounded like dogs barking. Thought you said you didn't have any coyotes," Frank repeated firmly. "They get vocal this time of year." Right. Clyde nodded, then gestured toward Frank's left hand. That's a military ring, isn't it? You serve Vietnam. Long time ago. Thank you for your service. Clyde smiled. You know, I've always had a respect for military working dogs. Amazing animals. Loyal to the end. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly at the pointed comment. Most dogs are loyal if you treat 'em right. True enough. Clyde backed toward his truck. Well, enjoy the beer, neighbor. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. As the truck pulled away, Frank pulled out his cell phone and dialed Wilson again. I need a background check on a Clyde Barrow, he said without preamble. Just moved to the Miller place next door. Too interested in dogs for my comfort. I'll see what I can find, Wilson promised. In the meantime, we've got movement on our end. There's an FBI team that wants those dogs. Peterson? The right kind of people. They'll be there tomorrow. Frank hung up and stared at the barn, doubt gnawing at him. Tomorrow was when Robert was due home. Tomorrow. Everything would change one way or another. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Emily slipped into the barn, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in a paper towel clutched in her small hand. The dogs had come to expect her morning visits, and even Scout, the most nervous of the five, now wagged his tail at her approach. Commander maintained his vigilant watch from the hayloft, his vantage point offering a clear view of the driveway and surrounding fields. "Good morning," Emily whispered, setting down the sandwich and breaking it into 5 roughly equal pieces. 4 of the dogs moved forward to accept their portions, but Ghost remained in his corner, watching with those haunted gray eyes. Emily approached him slowly, piece of sandwich extended. "It's okay," she said softly. "You need to eat to get strong again." Ghost's eyes darted between Emily's face and the offered food. Something in the dog's gaze seemed almost human in its complexity. Fear mingled with longing, distrust warring with desperate hope. "I won't hurt you," Emily promised. "I know someone hurt you before, but I'm not them." After a tense moment, Ghost inched forward, his movement stiff from healing wounds. He delicately took the bread from her fingers, their eyes locked in silent communication. Emily remained perfectly still as Ghost ate, and when he finished, she slowly, so slowly, extended her hand toward his head. Ghost flinched, and Emily immediately pulled back. "That's okay," she assured him. "We have time." From the barn doorway, Frank watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and concern. His granddaughter possessed a natural gift with animals, the same gift his late wife had demonstrated. The same intuitive understanding that had made Catherine Peterson beloved by every creature she encountered. But this situation was far more dangerous than nursing injured songbirds or bottle-feeding orphaned foals. "Emily," he called softly. "Bus will be here in 20 minutes. Better get your backpack ready." As Emily reluctantly left the barn, Frank approached Ghost's corner, kneeling despite the protest of his arthritic joints. The dog watched him warily. "I know what you are," Frank said quietly. "I was there once, too. War changes you, makes you see the world different." He extended his hand, palm down, at a safe distance. "But you're safe here. You all are." Ghost didn't approach, but his tense posture relaxed slightly. Frank nodded and stood, understanding passing between man and dog. Sometimes the deepest wounds were the ones you couldn't see. After sending Emily off to school, Frank returned to the barn with purpose. From a locked chest in the back of his pickup, he retrieved items he hadn't touched in decades: a training whistle, hand signal cards, and a worn manual with U.S. Army Canine Training Protocols stamped on its cover. One by one, Frank worked with each dog, assessing their training and abilities. Commander responded to advanced tactical commands with military precision. Scout demonstrated exceptional tracking skills. Following a scent trail, Frank laid through the property without hesitation. Shadow showed remarkable stealth capabilities, moving silently even through dry leaves. Ranger proved himself the strength of the unit, capable of bringing down a man twice Frank's size if commanded. Only Ghost remained unresponsive to training exercises, watching from his corner, too traumatized to participate. By mid-afternoon, Frank had confirmed what he'd suspected. These weren't just any military working dogs. They were an elite tactical unit, trained for high-risk operations involving narcotics interdiction and VIP protection. The kind of unit that would only be deployed for the most sensitive missions. As Frank made notes in a small pocket notebook, he noticed Commander's attention suddenly focus on the driveway. Moments later, the sound of tires on gravel reached his ears. "Doctor." Mitchell's truck appeared, but she wasn't alone. Sheriff Donovan sat in the passenger seat, his expression grim beneath his department-issued Stetson. Frank quickly closed the barn doors, leaving just enough space to slip out, and walked casually toward the approaching vehicle. "Afternoon, Sarah," he called, nodding at her companion. "Sheriff." Sheriff Donovan was a heavy-set man in his 50s with 20 years on the force and a reputation for running the county with an iron fist. "Frank," he acknowledged. "Sarah here tells me you've had some trouble with strays." Frank shot Dr. Mitchell a look, but her expression revealed nothing. "Just a couple of mutts passing through," he replied easily. "Nothing I can't handle?" The sheriff removed his sunglasses. "Mind if I take a look? We've had reports of dangerous dogs in the county. Wouldn't want your granddaughter getting hurt." "Appreciate the concern," Frank said, positioning himself between the sheriff and the barn. "But these dogs are gentle as lambs. No need to trouble yourself." Sheriff Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Funny thing, Frank, got a call from a concerned citizen about barking out this way. Said it sounded like multiple dogs, military-type dogs." Frank maintained his neutral expression. "People hear all sorts of things. Probably coyotes." "Probably," the sheriff agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Still, I'd feel better having a look." Before Frank could object further, Dr. Mitchell intervened. "Actually, Sheriff, I need to speak with Frank about some medication for those strays. Rabies protocols and such. Official vet business. Mind giving us a minute?" The sheriff hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll wait in the truck." Once he was out of earshot, Dr. Mitchell grabbed Frank's arm. "I didn't tell him anything," she whispered urgently. "He showed up at my clinic asking questions. Someone tipped him off." "Clyde Barrow," Frank muttered. "Listen to me. Frank, something's not right. The sheriff was asking very specific questions about military working dogs. How would he even know to ask that?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Get him out of here, Sarah. Tell him whatever you need to, but get him off my property." Dr. Mitchell nodded and returned to the truck. After a brief conversation, She and the sheriff drove away, but not before Donovan gave the barn one last, lingering look. Frank waited until they were gone before pulling out his cell phone. Wilson answered on the first ring. "Peterson, I was about to call you. We've got a problem. The FBI team that's coming for the dogs, we can't verify their credentials. Something's off." Frank watched the dust cloud from the departing vehicle disappear down the road. "Sheriff just paid me a visit. Too interested in military dogs." "Jesus," Wilson breathed. "Peterson, listen to me. Don't trust anyone. Those dogs are witnesses to something big. I've been digging, and that operation in Tennessee, it wasn't just about drugs. There was a thumb drive with evidence about corruption going straight to federal level. The dogs were specially trained to find and protect digital evidence." Frank's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying whoever set up that ambush is still looking for what those dogs might be carrying, and they'll kill to get it." After hanging up, Frank returned to the barn. The dogs were in defensive positions, Commander at the hayloft window, Shadow by the side door, Ranger and Scout flanking the main entrance. Only Ghost remained in his corner, but even he was alert, ears forward. Frank approached Commander, examining the damaged collar more carefully. There, almost invisible in the torn fabric, was a small bulge. Using his pocket knife, Frank carefully cut into the lining and extracted a tiny waterproof case. Inside was a micro USB drive. "So that's what they're after," he murmured. "Thou." That evening, when Emily returned from school, Frank met her at the bus stop rather than waiting at the house as usual. "Pop, she questioned, sensing something was wrong. "Everything's fine, Pumpkin," he assured her, taking her backpack. "But I thought we might play a game today." "What kind of game?" "A hide-and-seek game, like the one we played when the tornado warnings came last spring. Remember our special hiding place?" Emily's eyes widened slightly. The special hiding place was the reinforced storm cellar beneath the house, stocked with emergency supplies. They only used it during severe weather. "Is there a storm coming?" she asked, glancing at the clear autumn sky. Frank squeezed her shoulder gently. "Different kind of storm. Maybe. Just want to make sure you remember what to do. That's all." That night, after Emily was asleep, Frank sat at the kitchen table cleaning his old service pistol by the dim light above the stove. The USB drive lay beside him, a tiny object that somehow felt heavier than the weapon in his hands. A soft knock at the back door startled him. Frank moved silently to the window, pistol ready, and peered through the curtain. Dr. Mitchell stood on the porch, alone and visibly nervous. Frank opened the door just enough to let her slip inside. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah. I had to warn you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The sheriff came back to the clinic after hours, asking more questions. And he wasn't alone. There was a man in a suit with him. They wanted access to my patient records, specifically any recent treatments for military working dogs." "What did you tell them?" "That I hadn't treated any such animals. But Frank, they didn't believe me. They're watching my clinic now." She pulled a small bag from her coat. "I brought more antibiotics for Ghost and some painkillers." "You might need them." Frank accepted the supplies with a nod of thanks. "You should go. It's not safe for you to be associated with us right now." "What about Emily?" Dr. Mitchell asked. If trouble's coming, she shouldn't be here. Robert's due back tomorrow. If things go sideways, I've got a plan to get her out. Frank hesitated, then added, Sarah, if anything happens to me, there's a letter in my desk drawer for Robert. Make sure he gets it. After Dr. Mitchell left, Frank checked on Emily, watching her peaceful sleep for a long moment before continuing to the barn. The dogs greeted him silently, already alert to his presence before he entered. We've got complications. Boys, he told them, setting up a small camp bed in the corner. Tonight, he wouldn't leave them unguarded. As Frank settled onto the uncomfortable cot, Ghost surprised him by approaching, sniffing cautiously at his hand before retreating to his corner. Not quite trust, but progress nonetheless. The next morning brought heavy fog rolling across the fields, shrouding the farm in ethereal white. Frank stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, scanning what little he could see of the surrounding property. The dogs remained in the barn, but he'd left the small side door open for them if needed. Emily joined him, wrapping her small hand in his. Is Daddy coming home today? That's the plan. Pumpkin? Frank squeezed her hand reassuringly. How about you help me feed the chickens before the bus comes? As they crossed to the chicken coop, Frank noticed Commander watching from the barn, his posture indicating heightened vigilance. Something had the dog concerned. The school bus arrived at 7:30 as usual, but as Emily climbed aboard, Frank made a split-second decision. Mrs. Winters, he called to the driver, an older woman who'd been running this route for 20 years. Emily's not feeling well. Think I'll keep her home today. Mrs. Winters peered at him over her glasses. Everything all right, Frank? Just a precaution. Her daddy's coming home today, and she's been a bit feverish. Don't want to send her off if she's coming down with something. The driver nodded sympathetically. Lot of bugs going around. You take care. Emily. As the bus pulled away, Emily looked up at her grandfather in confusion. I'm not sick. Pop, Pop. I know. Pumpkin. But today's a special day. Thought you might help me with the dogs. Emily's face brightened, but Frank's attention was elsewhere. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, a vehicle had pulled off the county road near their property line. Inside the house, Frank made a quick call to Robert's cell phone, which went straight to voicemail. Robert, it's Dad. When you get this, don't come straight to the house. Call me first. It's important. He hesitated, then added, Be careful, son. Emily spent the morning in the barn, drawing pictures for each dog while Frank made periodic checks of the perimeter. By noon, the fog had mostly lifted, revealing a clear autumn day. Still no sign of Robert, whose truck should have been arriving any time now. As Emily worked on a particularly detailed drawing of Commander, she suddenly stopped, her crayon hovering above the paper. Pop, Pop, she said quietly. Ghost is trying to tell me something. Frank knelt beside her. What do you mean, Pumpkin? He keeps showing me pictures in my head, a man with a star on his shirt, and another man with shiny shoes. They're coming here, but they're not coming to help. Frank looked at Ghost, who had risen to his feet, ears forward, body tense. The other dogs had also assumed alert postures. Emily, Frank said calmly, I need you to gather your drawings. We're going to play that hiding game now. Because of the men Ghost showed me. That's right. You remember where to go and what to do?" Emily nodded solemnly. "The storm cellar. Stay quiet. Don't come out until you or Daddy comes for me." "That's my brave girl." As they left the barn, the sound of an approaching vehicle made them both freeze. But it wasn't Robert's familiar truck that appeared around the bend. It was Sheriff Donovan's patrol car, followed by a black SUV with tinted windows. "Go now," Frank whispered urgently. "Straight to the cellar. Don't look back." Emily clutched her drawings to her chest and ran toward the house, keeping low as Frank had taught her. Frank walked calmly toward the approaching vehicles, positioning himself to block any view of his granddaughter's retreat. Sheriff Donovan stepped out of his patrol car, hand resting casually near his holstered weapon. From the SUV emerged a man in an expensive suit, his shoes indeed shiny enough to catch the sunlight. "Afternoon, Frank," the sheriff called. "This here is Special Agent Mercer with the DEA. He's got some questions about some missing evidence from a case." Frank maintained a neutral expression, though his heart hammered in his chest. Emily should be safely in the cellar by now. And the dogs were nowhere in sight, which meant they'd fallen back to secondary positions as trained. "Don't know anything about any evidence," Frank replied evenly, "but you're welcome to ask your questions." Agent Mercer stepped forward, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Mr. Peterson, we have reason to believe some specialized canine units from a recent operation might have found their way to your property. Units that might be carrying something that belongs to us." Frank crossed his arms. "Don't know what you're talking about." "I don't have any dogs." Sheriff Donovan's expression hardened. "Frank, we've got multiple reports of dogs on your property. Why don't you save us all some time and tell us where they are? Like I said, no dogs here, just me and my granddaughter." Agent Mercer's smile faded. "Mr. Peterson, those dogs are government property. Harboring them is a federal offense. Additionally, they may be carrying evidence crucial to national security. If I see any government dogs, I'll be sure to call you," Frank replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The sheriff and agent exchanged glances. Then, with a slight nod from Mercer, Sheriff Donovan spoke again. "Frank Peterson, we have a warrant to search these premises for missing government property and evidence relating to a federal investigation." He produced a folded document from his pocket. "Please, step aside." Frank took the warrant, scanning it quickly. It appeared legitimate, though he noticed it had been signed by Judge Hamilton, known locally as the sheriff's poker buddy. "Fine," Frank said, stepping aside. "But my granddaughter is napping. I'd appreciate if you kept the noise down." As the men moved toward the house, Frank caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye's shadow, living up to his name, slipping silently along the edge of the property toward the road. Following a flanking pattern Frank recognized from his military days, the dogs were deploying. They sensed the threat. And somewhere on the road leading to the farm, Robert Peterson's truck was approaching, unaware of the danger that awaited. Robert Peterson's battered Ford F-150 rounded the final bend in the county road, the familiar sight of his childhood home appearing through the windshield. After 3 weeks hauling freight across the Midwest, the weathered white farmhouse represented something that had become increasingly rare in his life stability. Not that he'd been particularly stable since Laura's death. The 18 months since the accident had been a blur of long-haul routes and motel rooms, each mile putting more distance between himself and the memories that haunted him. He'd missed Emily's birthday last month. The guilt of that still gnawed at him. The small package wrapped in colorful paper sitting on the passenger seat, a poor substitute for his presence. His father had been right all those times he'd called Robert a coward for running from his grief, from his responsibilities. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he'd stay more than 2 days. As the truck approached the property line, Robert noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked on the shoulder about 50 yards from the farm's entrance, a silver pickup with tinted windows. Probably nothing. But years on the road had taught him to notice details others might miss. He slowed slightly, brow furrowing as he passed. Then, as he turned into the long gravel driveway, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. A sheriff's patrol car and a black SUV were parked in front of the house. His father stood on the porch, arms crossed, facing Sheriff Donovan and a man in a suit Robert didn't recognize. Something was wrong, very wrong. Robert pulled up behind the SUV and cut the engine. As he stepped out of his truck, he caught his father's eye. Frank's expression remained neutral, but Robert recognized the subtle head shake, a warning. "Well, look who's home," Sheriff Donovan called, turning to face him. "Robert Peterson. Perfect timing." "Sheriff," Robert acknowledged cautiously. "Everything okay here?" The man in the suit stepped forward, extending his hand. "Agent Mercer, DEA. You must be Frank's son." Robert shook the offered hand reflexively, his unease growing. "What's this about?" "Just executing a search warrant," Sheriff Donovan explained. "Looking for some missing property." Frank's voice carried from the porch, calm but firm. "I was just telling these gentlemen that my granddaughter is napping. They'll need to keep it down." The emphasis on granddaughter and napping sent a chill down Robert's spine. His father never let Emily nap during the day, something about maintaining proper sleep schedules. It was a code, a warning that Emily was hiding somewhere. "Of course," Robert replied smoothly. "She had trouble sleeping last night. Was excited about me coming home." He turned to Agent Mercer. "What kind of property are you looking for? Maybe I can help." "Specialized canine unit," Mercer responded, watching Robert's face carefully. "Military working dogs that went missing after an operation last week." Robert maintained a neutral expression, though his mind raced. Dogs. What the hell had happened while he was gone? "Haven't seen any dogs around here in years," he said with a shrug. "But feel free to look around. I need to talk to my father about some repairs anyway." As Robert climbed the porch steps to join Frank, Sheriff Donovan and Agent Mercer began walking toward the barn. 2 deputies from a second patrol car Robert hadn't initially noticed falling in behind them. "What's going on?" Robert whispered urgently. "Emily's in the storm cellar," Frank murmured, his eyes never leaving the men heading toward the barn. "And there are 5 military dogs hiding on the property. They're witnesses to something big, something that got their handlers killed. These men are here to make sure those dogs don't talk." "Dogs don't talk, Dad," Robert hissed, wondering if his father had finally lost his grip on reality. "The evidence they're carrying does." Frank turned to face his son directly. "Listen to me very carefully. I need you to get Emily and get off this property. There's a micro USB drive in my left pocket. Take it to Wilson at Fort Campbell. He'll know what to do with it." Before Robert could respond, a shout came from the direction of the barn. "We've got blood here. And dog hair," one of the deputies called. "Looks like they were keeping animals in here recently." Agent Mercer turned toward the house. "Mr. Peterson, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are the dogs?" Frank stepped off the porch, moving toward the men with his hands visible. "Like I said, no dogs here." The moment seemed to stretch, tension crackling in the air like the electricity before a summer storm. Then, from somewhere in the surrounding fields, a single bark echoed sharp, commanding. Sheriff Donovan drew his weapon, spinning toward the sound. "Over there, in the cornfield. Secure the suspects," Agent Mercer ordered, drawing his own sidearm. "They're here somewhere." As the deputies moved toward Frank and Robert, the world erupted into chaos. From different directions came a series of coordinated barks, not random noise, but a tactical pattern Robert recognized from his own brief military service before trucking. The dogs were communicating, creating confusion about their positions. "Get down!" Frank shouted, tackling Robert to the ground as gunfire erupted. One of the deputies had fired toward the sound in the cornfield, only to be answered by a blur of movement from behind the barn commander, launching himself at the man with military precision, targeting the arm holding the weapon. The deputy screamed as powerful jaws clamped around his wrist, the gun falling to the dirt. Before anyone could react, the dog released and disappeared back into the shadows. "Jesus Christ!" Sheriff Donovan yelled, firing wildly toward where Commander had vanished. "Shoot the damn dogs!" Robert's training took over, while the men's attention was directed toward the cornfield and barn. He rolled beneath the porch, scrambling through the crawl space toward the back of the house. Behind him, he heard his father's voice, loud and clear, "Alpha Team, engage!" It was a command Robert had never heard his father use, but the response was immediate and terrifying. From multiple directions, the German shepherds emerged, moving with coordinated precision. Shadow materialized beside the SUV, teeth bared at Agent Mercer. Scout appeared at the edge of the driveway, cutting off escape to the road. Ranger charged from behind the chicken coop, powerful and intimidating. The fourth dog, one with white-gray fur and healing wounds, limped from beneath the porch steps, positioning himself between Frank and the sheriff, growling low and dangerous despite his injuries. Agent Mercer aimed his weapon at the nearest dog. "Call them off. Peterson, now." "Can't do that," Frank replied calmly. "They don't answer to me. They're making their own decisions now." Meanwhile, Robert had reached the back of the house, staying low. He sprinted to the storm cellar doors, hidden behind the old oak tree. "Emily," he whispered urgently, knocking softly. "It's Daddy. Open up." The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Emily's small face appeared, pale but composed. "Daddy, there are bad men here. Ghost told me." "Ghost?" Robert shook his head. "Never mind, we need to go. Pumpkin, right now." He scooped her into his arms, her backpack clutched in her small hands. "We need to be very quiet, okay?" Emily nodded solemnly. "Like when we play hide and seek." Robert carried her toward the tree line behind the house, keeping to the shadows. The sounds of confrontation continued from the front yard, shouting, barking, the occasional shot fired. Every instinct screamed at him to go back for his father. but Emily's safety had to come first. They had nearly reached the cover of the woods when Robert heard the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked behind him. "That's far enough. Peterson." Robert turned slowly, shielding Emily with his body. Sheriff Donovan stood 20 yards away, shotgun aimed directly at them, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Put the girl down and hand over the evidence," Donovan ordered, his voice eerily calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Robert replied, his mind racing for options. "The USB drive, Peterson. We know the dogs brought it here. Your father has it." Emily's small voice piped up from behind Robert. "Pop gave it to Daddy. It's in his pocket." Robert felt a moment of pure terror as Donovan's finger tightened on the trigger. "Hand it over, nice and slow," the sheriff demanded. "No one needs to get hurt here." "You're going to kill us anyway," Robert said, the truth of it settling in his gut like a stone. Donovan's smile was cold. "Not the girl. She's innocent in all this. But you and your father, you made your choice when you harbored those dogs." As Robert weighed his impossible options, a silver pickup truck suddenly roared into view from the side of the property. Skidding to a halt between Robert and the sheriff, Clyde Barrow leaped out, weapon drawn. "Federal agent," he shouted, aiming at Donovan. "Drop your weapon." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Donovan swung the shotgun toward Clyde, and 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Donovan fell, clutching his shoulder, while Clyde dropped to one knee, blood blossoming on his thigh. "Get in the truck," Clyde shouted to Robert. "Now!" Robert didn't hesitate. He threw open the passenger door, deposited Emily inside, and climbed in after her. Clyde dragged himself into the driver's seat, grimacing in pain. "My father," Robert began. "Your father can handle himself." Clyde cut him off, gunning the engine. "We need to get that evidence and your daughter to safety." The truck careened down the driveway, past the chaos still unfolding in the front yard. Robert caught a glimpse of his father standing amidst the dogs, facing down Agent Mercer, whose weapon seemed to have jammed. The dogs had formed a protective circle, each facing outward, covering all angles of approach. Commander's eyes met Robert's as the truck passed, and in that brief moment, Robert understood what his father had meant. These weren't just animals. They were soldiers, protecting their mission to the end. As the truck reached the county road, a massive explosion rocked the farmhouse. Flames erupted from one of the windows, the kitchen, where the ancient gas stove stood. "Dad!" Robert screamed, reaching for the door handle. Clyde grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No, that's a diversion. Your father said it himself." "Look." Through the rear window, Robert saw Frank emerging from the smoke, Commander at his side, the other dogs flanking them as they ran toward the cornfield. Agent Mercer and the remaining deputy, momentarily distracted by the explosion, fired wildly after them. "He'll meet us at the rendezvous point," Clyde assured him, pressing down on the accelerator. "If we can make it there." Emily clutched her backpack to her chest, eyes wide but dry. "The dogs will protect Pop," she said with absolute certainty. "Especially Ghost. He promised me." Robert stared at his daughter, then at Clyde, whose badge was now visible inside his open jacket. FBI, not DEA. "Who are you really?" Robert demanded. Clyde grimaced as he navigated the winding country road at dangerous speed. "The name's Agent Daniel Clark, FBI. I've been tracking the corruption in the Tennessee operation for months." "Those dogs your father found, they're the only witnesses we have to a conspiracy that goes all the way to Washington. And my father knew this. Not at first, but he figured enough out to know those dogs needed protecting." Clark checked the rearview mirror. "And now we all need protecting. That USB drive contains enough evidence to bring down some very powerful people." Behind them, 2 black SUVs appeared on the road, gaining quickly. "Daddy," Emily said calmly, "Commander says we need to turn left at the big rock." Robert stared at his daughter in confusion. "What commander isn't even here?" Emily pointed ahead to where the county road forked near a massive boulder. "Left. Daddy, the dogs have a plan." Clark looked at Robert questioningly. Robert hesitated, then nodded. "Left at the rock. Trust me." As the truck swerved left onto a narrow dirt road, the pursuing vehicles followed directly into the path of Ranger and Scout, who burst from the undergrowth in a coordinated attack on the lead SUV's tires. The vehicle swerved violently, crashing into the second SUV and sending both into the ditch. "My God," Clark breathed. "How did she know?" Robert looked at his daughter with new eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "we've all underestimated what these dogs are capable of." The truck sped on through the Kentucky countryside, carrying its precious cargo, a little girl, a wounded FBI agent, a grieving father, and a tiny USB drive that might just change everything. The abandoned hunting cabin stood deep in the Kentucky woods, its weathered logs almost invisible among the autumn foliage. Agent Clark, or Clyde Barrow, as Frank had known him, guided the truck along an overgrown trail barely deserving of the word road. The vehicle lurched and bounced over exposed roots and rocks, each jolt causing him to wince as blood continued to seep through the makeshift bandage on his thigh. "Almost there," he assured Robert, who sat tensely in the passenger seat, one arm protectively around Emily. The little girl had fallen into an exhausted sleep against her father's side, her backpack still clutched tightly to her chest. "My father knew to come here?" Robert asked, his voice low to avoid waking Emily. Clark nodded grimly. "Plan B location. We established it yesterday when things started looking suspicious. Your father's an old-school operator. Peterson, he doesn't leave anything to chance." The cabin appeared ahead, a small structure with boarded windows and a sagging porch. Clark killed the engine and sat listening for a moment, scanning the surrounding woods. "We should be safe here for a few hours," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But we need to move fast. Those men will regroup, and they know these woods as well as we do." Robert gently shook Emily awake. "Hey, Pumpkin, we're going to stay here for a little while." "Okay." Emily blinked sleepily. Then her eyes widened as memories returned. "Where's Pop-Pop and the dogs?" "They're coming," Clark assured her, though the worry lines around his eyes deepened. "They took a different route to throw off the bad guys." Inside, the cabin was Spartan but serviceable, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace, and 2 narrow cots pushed against opposite walls. Clark immediately went to a loose floorboard near the hearth, retrieving a metal box containing a first aid kit, ammunition, and a satellite phone. "Let me see that leg," Robert said, helping Clark to a chair. The FBI agent's pants were soaked with blood, the bullet wound still oozing steadily. Through and through. Clark grimaced as Robert cut away the fabric. Lucky shot. Lucky would be missing entirely, Robert countered, cleaning the wound with supplies from the kit. This needs stitches. Later. First, we need to secure the perimeter. Robert finished bandaging Clark's leg, then moved to the windows, checking the boards for gaps that might allow anyone to see inside. Emily sat quietly at the table, opening her backpack to reveal her notebook and crayons. "Daddy," she said suddenly, her voice eerily calm. "Ranger is hurt bad." Robert froze, turning to stare at his daughter. "Emily, how could you possibly know that—" She looked up, her young face solemn. "Ghost told me." "In my head." Clark and Robert exchanged concerned glances. The trauma of the day was clearly affecting her. "It's okay, Pumpkin," Robert soothed. "You're just worried about them, but I'm sure they're—" A low whistle from outside interrupted him, 3 short notes followed by 1 long. Clark immediately reached for his weapon. "That's your father," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God." Robert hurried to the door, opening it just enough to allow Frank to slip inside. The older man's clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with soot from the fire, but he was remarkably unharmed. "Where are the dogs?" Clark demanded. Frank's expression darkened. "Commander and Shadow are standing guard outside. Scout went back to try and lead them away from our trail." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Ranger took a bullet protecting our escape route. Ghost stayed with him." Emily looked up, tears filling her eyes. "I told you Ranger was hurt, Daddy." Frank moved to his granddaughter, kneeling despite the protest of his aging joints. "How did you know that, Pumpkin?" "Ghost told me," she repeated. "He shows me pictures sometimes." Instead of dismissing her, Frank nodded seriously. "I believe you. These dogs, they're special. They've formed a connection with you that I don't fully understand." Robert ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Dad, that's not possible. Emily's just intuitive about animals, like Mom was." "It's more than that," Frank insisted. "Emily's been drawing things she couldn't possibly know details about the handlers, about the operation in Tennessee. These dogs, especially Ghost, are communicating with her somehow." Clark cleared his throat. "Actually, there might be some explanation for that. These dogs were part of an experimental training program called Empathic Response Initiative. They were specially selected for their unusual sensitivity to human emotions, then trained to form deep psychological bonds with their handlers. Some handlers reported near telepathic connections after months of intensive work." "You're saying these dogs can read minds?" Robert asked incredulously. "Not exactly." Clark winced as he shifted his injured leg. "But they can form profound emotional connections, especially with people who are receptive to them. Children are often more open to this kind of connection." Frank nodded. "Emily has that gift, like your mother did." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Robert had spent so long running from his grief that he'd almost forgotten how deeply Laura had connected with animals, how she'd always seemed to know what they needed, what they felt. Emily had inherited that same intuition, and he'd been too absent to notice. The quiet was shattered by a low, urgent bark from outside Commander's warning signal. Frank moved to the window, peering through a crack in the boards. "Vehicle approaching," he reported. "Black SUV, moving slow. They're searching." Clark attempted to stand but collapsed back into the chair, his face pale from blood loss. "We need to move. Now." Frank shook his head. "You're in no condition. And it's getting dark. We make a run for it. We're sitting ducks." "So we just wait to be found?" Robert demanded. "No," Frank replied, his voice taking on the commanding tone that Robert remembered from childhood. "We prepare. This cabin has a root cellar. Emily and the USB drive go down there. You stay with her. Clark and I will handle whatever comes." "The hell I will," Robert protested. "I'm not hiding while you put yourself at risk. This isn't negotiable, son. Emily needs protection, and you're the only one she trusts completely." Frank's expression softened slightly. "You've been running long enough, Robert. Time to stand your ground by protecting your daughter." Before Robert could argue further, another bark from Commander, more urgent this time. Frank grabbed a shotgun from behind the door. "They're coming up the trail. Get Emily to the cellar. Now." Robert hesitated only a moment before scooping Emily into his arms. "Where's the entrance?" Frank pulled the worn rug aside, revealing a trap door. "Down there. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. Don't come out until one of us calls the all-clear phrase." "What's the phrase?" Robert asked, already lowering Emily into the dark space below. "Laura's roses are blooming," Frank replied softly. "Your mother's favorite flowers." Emily looked up at her grandfather, tears streaming down her small face. Pop, Ghost says Ranger isn't breathing anymore." Frank's weathered face crumpled momentarily before he regained control. "I know, Pumpkin. Ranger was a hero." He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Now be brave, like he was." As Robert descended into the cellar with Emily, the last thing he saw was his father and Agent Clark positioning themselves on either side of the cabin's only door, weapons ready, faces set with grim determination as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. The trapdoor closed, plunging father and daughter into darkness. The sounds of preparation for battle muffled above them. The root cellar smelled of damp earth and forgotten potatoes, its darkness almost absolute save for the thin sliver of light seeping through the edges of the trapdoor. Robert held Emily close, his back pressed against the cool dirt wall, straining to hear the muffled sounds from above. His daughter's small body trembled against his chest, but she remained eerily silent, as if understanding that their lives depended on absolute quiet. "It'll be okay, Pumpkin," Robert whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. Pop and Agent Clark know what they're doing." Emily nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, she opened her backpack, the sound of rustling paper unnaturally loud in the confined space. Robert couldn't see what she was doing, but he felt her shift as she extracted something from the bag. "Ghost is coming," she whispered suddenly. "With Shadow." Before Robert could respond, the faint sound of footsteps approached the cabin, followed by the creak of the porch steps. A moment later, a sharp knock echoed through the floorboards above. "Kentucky Wildlife Service," called an unfamiliar voice. "Just checking hunting permits in the area." The transparent lie hung in the air. No wildlife officer would patrol this deep in the woods after dark. Frank's gruff voice responded, loudly enough to be heard through the floor. "No hunting here. This is private property. We have reports of illegal activity in the area. Need to take a look around. Got a warrant? Frank challenged. A pause. Then, don't need one if we have probable cause. Open up, or we'll force entry. Robert's hand instinctively moved to where his sidearm would be, forgetting he wasn't armed. His father had the shotgun, and Clark had his service weapon. Down here, Robert had nothing but his body to shield Emily if they were discovered. The sound of splintering wood cut through the silence as the cabin door was forced open. Then, chaos erupted above shouts. The thunder of a shotgun blast, the sharper reports of handguns. A heavy body crashed against the floor directly above them, sending dust raining down from between the wooden slats. Emily buried her face against Robert's chest, her small hands covering her ears. The gunfire continued for what seemed like an eternity, but was likely only seconds, followed by an eerie silence broken only by labored breathing and the scrape of furniture being moved. "Clear the rest of the cabin," ordered a voice Robert didn't recognize. "They've got to be here somewhere." Footsteps moved methodically across the floor above, accompanied by the sound of furniture being overturned and cabinets being opened. Robert held his breath as the steps approached the area of the trap door, then paused. "What's under this rug?" someone asked. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. He pressed Emily closer, his mind racing for options that didn't exist. The cellar had no other exit. Just as the footsteps stopped directly above the trapdoor, a commotion erupted outside the cabin. Savage barking followed by shouts of alarm and pain, the footsteps above rushed away toward the new threat. "The dogs! Watch out for the dogs!" More gunfire, more shouting. Through it all, Robert could make out the distinctive sounds of Commander's deep bark and Shadow's growling. The dogs were creating a diversion. Emily tugged at Robert's sleeve. "Ghost is at the window," she whispered. "He wants us to come out." "Emily, there's no way Ghost could tell you that," Robert began, but fell silent as a soft scratching sound came from the small, ground-level window at the far end of the root cellar. A window so dirty and overgrown Robert hadn't even noticed it in the darkness. Moving carefully, Robert crawled with Emily toward the sound. Through the grime-covered glass, he could just make out a ghostly white-gray shape moving on the other side. "It's him," Emily whispered excitedly. "It's Ghost." The window was small, too small for an adult to fit through, but possibly large enough for a child Emily's size. Robert examined the frame, finding it partially rotted and loose in the soil. "Stand back," he whispered, then braced himself and pushed against the wooden frame with all his strength. With a groan of protest, the entire window assembly pulled free from the surrounding dirt, creating an opening roughly 2 feet square. Cold night air rushed in, along with Ghost's face, his intelligent eyes reflecting what little moonlight filtered through the trees. The dog whined softly, then backed away from the opening, clearly indicating they should follow. "I can't fit through there," Robert realized aloud. "But you can. Pumpkin." Emily nodded solemnly. "Ghost will protect me. Listen to me." Robert gripped her shoulders, his voice urgent but steady. "I need you to go with Ghost. He'll keep you safe while I help Pop and Agent Clark. Take this." He pressed the USB drive into her small palm. "And don't give it to anyone except me. Pop or Agent Clark." "Understand?" Emily nodded again, clutching the tiny device. "What about the bad men?" "Ghost will hide you from them. Trust him." Robert swallowed hard, hating himself for sending his 6-year-old daughter out alone, even with the dog for protection. but keeping her in the cellar was no longer safe. "I'll find you as soon as I can." With one last fierce hug, Robert helped Emily through the narrow opening. Ghost was waiting on the other side, pressing his body protectively against the child as soon as her feet touched the ground. The dog looked directly at Robert, and in that moment, a wordless understanding passed between man and animal. "Protect her with your life," Robert's eyes pleaded. "I will." Ghost's steady gaze seemed to answer. Then they were gone, the white-gray shape and the small girl melting into the darkness of the surrounding woods. Robert turned back toward the trapdoor, listening as the chaos continued above. He needed a weapon, anything to help even the odds. The cellar contained little besides rotting shelves and ancient preserve jars. But in the corner, Robert found a rusted shovel. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He positioned himself beneath the trapdoor, shovel raised, waiting for his moment. It came sooner than expected. The rug above was ripped away, and light suddenly flooded into the cellar as the trapdoor was flung open. A flashlight beam swept the space, temporarily blinding Robert. "There's someone down here," a voice called out. As a figure began to descend the crude ladder, Robert swung the shovel with all his strength. The metal blade connected with a satisfying crack, and the intruder tumbled the rest of the way down, landing in a motionless heap at Robert's feet. Robert quickly relieved the unconscious man of his pistol and extra magazine. Now armed, he climbed the ladder and emerged into a scene of devastation. The cabin's interior was in shambles, furniture overturned and riddled with bullet holes. Agent Clark lay slumped against the far wall, blood staining his shirt from a fresh wound in his shoulder. Frank was nowhere to be seen. "Clark," Robert hurried to the FBI agent's side. "Where's my father?" Clark coughed, blood speckling his lips. "They took him. Mercer recognized him from somewhere. Said your father knew too much." His breathing was labored, his skin ashen. "Said he'd make him talk about the evidence." "How many men?" "5. Maybe 6. Clark grimaced in pain. "Plus Mercer. Your father injured 2 before they overpowered him. Commander and Shadow created enough confusion for me to hide behind the woodpile. They thought I was dead." When Robert checked Clark's wounds, the shoulder injury was bleeding steadily, and the earlier leg wound had reopened. Without proper medical attention soon, the agent wouldn't survive the night. "Emily?" Clark asked weakly. "Safe. Ghost got her out through the root cellar. She has the USB drive." Clark nodded, relief momentarily overriding his pain. "Smart. That dog. Remarkable animal. Your daughter. Special connection with him. Outside." The sounds of engines starting cut through the night. Robert moved to the shattered window, watching as 2 black SUVs pulled away from the cabin, headlights cutting through the darkness as they headed back toward the main road. His father was in one of those vehicles. "They're taking him to the old hunting lodge," Clark said, his voice growing weaker. "It's their local base of operations, about 5 miles north of here." "How do you know that?" "Been investigating them for months." Clark coughed again, more blood appearing. "Your father, he knew what he was getting into. Told me, if anything happened, give you this." With trembling fingers, Clark withdrew a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Robert took it, recognizing his father's handwriting immediately. Robert, the note began, if you're reading this, things haven't gone as planned. The USB drive contains evidence of corruption reaching the highest levels of law enforcement and government, the results of an operation your mother was involved in before her death. Robert's blood ran cold. My mother. What does she have to do with this? Laura Peterson wasn't killed in a random accident, Clark confirmed, each word clearly causing him pain. She was an FBI analyst working on a joint task force investigating corruption. She discovered evidence connecting Sheriff Donovan to a major drug trafficking organization with political protection. The accident that killed her was a professional hit. Robert sat heavily on an overturned chair, his world tilting on its axis. For 18 months, he'd believed his wife died because of a drunk driver crossing the center line, a senseless, random tragedy. Now he was being told it was murder, a deliberate silencing. The operation in Tennessee, Clark continued, was a continuation of her work. Those dogs were there to find hidden evidence their handlers suspected existed. Instead, they walked into an ambush. The dogs escaped with the evidence. Laura first identified a direct financial link between the cartel, Sheriff Donovan, and 3 federal judges who've been dismissing cases against major traffickers. Robert scanned the rest of his father's note, which contained coordinates and instructions for a secure FBI contact, someone outside the normal chain of command who could be trusted. Why did the dogs come to our farm? Robert asked, struggling to process the flood of revelations. Your father was in the system as a former canine handler, Clark explained. But more than that, your mother had programmed the farm's location as a safe house in case of emergency. Those dogs were following Laura's contingency plan. Robert's hand tightened around the note. His mother, his father, his daughter, all connected to a conspiracy he'd known nothing about while he'd been driving trucks across the country, running from his grief. I need to find Emily, he said, standing abruptly. Then I'm going after my father. Clark grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. You can't take on Mercer's team alone. They're former special forces, working for the cartel. Watch me, Robert replied, checking the pistol's magazine. My father's all I have left. I'm not losing him too. As if summoned by his words, a soft whine came from the doorway. Shadow stood there, his dark form barely visible against the night, blood matting the fur on his flank from a graze wound. The dog's intelligent eyes met Robert's. Then he turned and looked pointedly in the direction the SUVs had gone. Looks like I won't be going alone, Robert said grimly. 3 months passed before the Peterson farm began to resemble itself again. The autumn chill had given way to winter's first tentative frosts, and the rebuilt barn stood freshly painted against the Kentucky hills. The house, too, had been repaired, new windows replacing those shattered in the firefight, a reinforced front door installed where the old one had been kicked in. Frank Peterson sat on the porch swing, a steaming mug of coffee warming his gnarled hands. At 72, he looked every day of his age, and then some. The events of that October night had added new lines to his weathered face, a slight tremor to his once steady hands, but his eyes remained sharp, watchful, as they surveyed the property from beneath the brim of his faded Vietnam veteran cap. The sound of Emily's laughter floated across the yard as she played near the oak tree, 5 German shepherds forming a protective circle around her. Ghost, his white-gray coat now glossy with health, never strayed more than a few feet from the little girl, The deep wounds that had nearly taken his life had healed into proud scars, badges of honor that matched those of his human companions. Commander, still regal despite the gray now frosting his muzzle, kept his position on a small rise overlooking the driveway, always on guard, always vigilant, as if the danger might return at any moment. Scout and Shadow worked as a pair, periodically patrolling the perimeter of the property before returning to Emily's side. And there, lying contentedly in a patch of weak winter sunlight, was Ranger once feared dead, now recovered from injuries that would have killed a lesser dog. His survival had been as improbable as their own. The screen door creaked, and Robert stepped onto the porch, 2 fresh mugs of coffee in hand. He handed one to his father before settling into the rocking chair beside him. The younger Peterson had changed in these months, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by something harder, more resolved. He no longer took long-haul routes, having accepted a local delivery position that kept him close to home, close to Emily. "Dr. Mitchell called," Robert said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Said she'll stop by this afternoon to check on Ranger's leg." Frank nodded. "That woman's been a godsend, taking care of 5 battle-scarred dogs without asking too many questions." "She knows enough," Robert replied. "She was there when the FBI team arrived, saw what those dogs did." Both men fell silent, remembering. The official story, the one reported in newspapers and on local television, was sanitized, simplified. A corrupt sheriff and federal agent uncovered in a joint FBI operation, evidence of their involvement in drug trafficking and obstruction of justice, convictions secured, sentences handed down. The true story was known only to a handful of people. How Robert, with Shadow and Commander, had tracked his father to the abandoned hunting lodge. How Emily and Ghost had led FBI Special Agent Wilson and his tactical team through the woods to the same location. How the dogs had worked together with military precision to create a diversion that allowed the rescue operation to succeed. And how Agent Clark, despite his grave injuries, had survived long enough to testify about the conspiracy that had claimed Laura Peterson's life. "Emily's teacher called yesterday," Frank said, changing the subject. "Said her drawings are concerning." Robert sighed. "I know. All those pictures of men with guns, of dogs fighting. The school counselor wants to see her next week. What are you going to tell them?" "The truth, or enough of it." Robert took a sip of his coffee. "That Emily witnessed a traumatic event, that she's processing it through her art, that the dogs are helping her heal." Frank's gaze shifted to his granddaughter, who was now lying in the grass with Ghost's head resting protectively on her small chest. "She's still talking about him showing her pictures in her head." Robert nodded. "Less often now. Dr. Harrison says it's probably a coping mechanism, a way for her to process what happened by attributing her own insights to the dog." He paused. "But sometimes, Dad, sometimes I wonder if there isn't more to it. Those dogs aren't ordinary animals, son. What they did, finding our farm, protecting Emily, working together to save us, goes beyond training, beyond instinct." Frank's voice took on a distant quality. "In Vietnam, we had a handler who swore his dog could sense ambushes before they happened, said they shared dreams sometimes. You believe that?" Frank shrugged. I believe there are things in this world we don't fully understand. Connections we can't explain. He nodded toward Emily and Ghost. Whatever they share, it saved all our lives. The crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Both men tensed instinctively, hands moving toward weapons that were no longer necessary but still kept close. Commander stood at attention, barking once an alert, not a warning. The black government SUV that pulled up was expected. Special Agent Wilson, the man who had taken charge of the case after Clark's testimony, stepped out in his customary crisp suit. Under his arm, he carried an official-looking leather portfolio. "Gentlemen," he greeted, climbing the porch steps. "Beautiful day." "Agent Wilson," Frank acknowledged. "Come for those papers. And to deliver these." Wilson handed the portfolio to Frank. "Official commendations for the K-9 team, as promised, and the adoption papers, signed by the Secretary of Defense himself." Frank leafed through the documents, his expression softening at the sight of the certificates bearing each dog's name, rank, and service record. "So it's official, then. They're ours." "With conditions," Wilson reminded him. "Annual evaluations, continued training, and they remain witnesses in ongoing federal cases." "Small price to pay," Robert said, watching as Emily noticed their visitor and began running toward the porch, all 5 dogs moving in perfect formation around her. "How's she doing?" Wilson asked, his official demeanor softening as Emily approached. "Better every day," Robert answered. "The nightmares are less frequent now." "And your father's physical therapy?" Frank flexed his right hand, where Mercer's men had broken 3 fingers during their interrogation. "Getting there. Another month, the doctor says." Emily bounded up the steps, Ghost at her heels. "Agent Wilson, did you bring the medals like you promised?" Wilson smiled, kneeling to her level. "I certainly did. Miss Peterson." He opened the portfolio to reveal 5 gleaming medals on blue ribbons. "Presidential Distinguished Service medals for each of your brave dogs." Emily's eyes widened. "Can I put them on them?" "That's why I'm here." As they moved to the yard for the impromptu ceremony, Frank hung back, watching his son and granddaughter with the dogs that had changed their lives. The tragedy that had brought them together was slowly being replaced by something new, not forgetting. Never that. But healing. Moving forward. Ghost looked back at Frank, those intelligent eyes seeming to convey understanding. Then the dog turned and pressed his body against Emily's side as Wilson placed the first medal around Commander's neck. "You know," Frank said quietly to Robert, "your mother would be proud of this. Of all of us." Robert nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "She always did have a soft spot for strays." "Wasn't just strays," Frank corrected gently. "Was anyone who needed protection. Anyone lost and trying to find their way home." As the winter sun broke through the clouds, bathing the ceremony in golden light, Frank Peterson watched his family, both human and canine, standing together, scarred but unbroken. After months of darkness, it felt, finally, like coming home. Folks, sometimes life throws storms at us that seem impossible to weather. We lose loved ones, we face betrayals, and we find ourselves isolated in our grief, just like Robert was. But the Peterson family story reminds us that it's never too late to stop running and stand your ground. Frank, at 72, showed us that the strength and skills we gained in our youth never truly leave us. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. When those German shepherds found their way to that Kentucky farm, they weren't just seeking shelter, they were searching for people who understood sacrifice and loyalty. People like us. The connection between little Emily and Ghost speaks to something we all know in our hearts, that sometimes the deepest bonds transcend words, that healing often comes from unexpected places, and that family isn't always blood. It's the people, and yes, sometimes the animals who stand beside us when the world turns dark. So tonight, when you look at your own scars, remember the Petersons. Remember that it's our wounds, visible and invisible, that make us